Hey there, so today we're going to be taking a look at the TRIGKEY Speed 5 versus the ACEMAGICIan AM06 Pro. So that is a Ryzen 5 5500U versus the Ryzen 5 5600U. Now the difference here is that the TRIGKEY is configured to have a stock TDP of 25 watts, while the ACEMAGICIan Mini PC is only configured for 15 watts. Now both of them in the BIOS will let you adjust the TDP to whatever you want, but of course there's really no reason to lower it in the TRIGKEY. And the ACEMAGICIan, if you raise it up to 25 watts, the system just cannot keep up with the heat, and it actually ends up affecting the overall performance of the system. But we're going to jump into some game comparisons to see how these two compare to each other with these different TDP configurations. So the first game we're taking a look at is Batman Arkham Knight. Here you can see running with the lowest in-game graphics settings at 1080p. Immediately the Ryzen 5 5500U is actually giving us the better result here, though not drastically different, but you can see that the system is actually utilizing more wattage than the hard limited 15 watts that the 5600U is at. And you'll see this as a consistent trend as we move forward onto Bioshock Infinite here at the very high graphics preset. The 5500U again ends up giving us the better result here, this time by a wider gap. And you'll see that the system is actually utilizing a decent amount more wattage here, and you'll see that the CPU and the GPU are now able to hit some higher clock speeds, with the GPU actually maxing out, something that the GPU in the ACEMAGICIan here is just not able to do. Now next up is Borderlands 3 here running at 1080p with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and again the Ryzen 5 5500U takes a pretty noticeable lead here. Neither one is going to be a very playable experience. In both situations you're better off dropping down to 900p or even 720p, but you can see that the Ryzen 5 5500U is pretty much utilizing the full 25 watts that it has access to, and that made a meaningful difference. Now here in Grid 2, you can see that the level of performance that we're getting between the two of them is again leaning towards the Ryzen 5 5500U just being an overall better system when it has the extra TDP. The IPC increase that came with Ryzen Zen 3 based CPUs hitting the market is, well, not enough to make up for the overall TDP difference. And you see that again carry over into Mafia 2 Definitive Edition, where there is a pretty noticeable gap in terms of the performance here, where the Ryzen 5 5500U is at a far more playable range than the 5600U with only 15 watts. And of course Metro Last Light continues to confirm the fact that the 5500U at 25 watts is still just a better overall system. And it makes sense because if you pay attention to the clock speeds of the GPU at 25 watts, we're pretty much always at its maximum clock speed. And what this means is that we're actually able to squeeze out the full performance of the Radeon 7 iGPU. And while it's certainly not remarkable, it does at least push a lot of these titles towards a more playable range, though Metro Exodus here isn't exactly one of those that I would consider to be very playable. But still, a title like Shadow of Mordor really shows that there is some meaningful gains to be had here, and all you're really doing is sacrificing just a little bit more in terms of wattage to the overall CPU. Now of course the ACEMAGICIan cannot support this. If you look at the temperatures that it's reaching already at just 15 watts, it's pretty brutal to see. And as you can see here in Mountain Blade 2 Bannerlord, the temperatures that it's reaching are pretty high up there, and the system does get pretty noticeably loud here. Now it isn't the loudest that it'll go to. If we were to try to raise the TDP, it will almost always be in the 90 to 100 degree range, which means the system will be absolutely screeching. Here it was passable enough, but it really did not give us a great gaming experience versus the Ryzen 5 5500U that is also a quieter system overall. Of course, Sleeping Dogs here running with the medium in-game graphics settings again shows a similar trend, though with surprising results, where the average actually ended up being higher on the 5600U, but the 1% lows were pretty noticeably lower. Overall, the Ryzen 5 5500U had the more consistent experience, but it was a surprising result considering how everything had gone so far. Of course, another one that actually ended up being kind of a surprise was Rainbow Six Siege. Here you could see that the Ryzen 5 5600U actually managed to score a pretty substantial lead over the Ryzen 5 5500U. There really does seem to be something about Zen 3 that this game in particular really likes, and it does end up boosting the performance pretty noticeably even with a lower TDP. Of course, cases like that are more outliers than anything else because almost all the time the Ryzen 5 5500U will just be a overall better experience. But there will be those rare titles where the Ryzen 5 5600U with a lower TDP actually does better. That being said, the Vega graphics in these APUs at this point are pretty dated and will struggle in most AAA titles that have come out in the last 5 to 7 years. RDNA 2 has made some pretty substantial gains, so if you have the money to go with a system that has RDNA 2 or a full dedicated graphics, you are going to be better off, but you're going to have a hard time finding a system this small that has more powerful hardware without actually spending quite a bit more money, which might be worth it to you, as you can see here with the Division 2 at 1080p with a 75% render resolution. The 5500U gives a pretty meaningful lead here and overall gives a far more playable experience. But again, this is a title that is quite a few years old now, and if we were on RDNA 2, we would actually be able to get far closer to a 60 FPS gaming experience. Still, there is a plethora of games that you can actually play on these chips, and as you can see here with World War Z on both of them, it's a playable enough experience, though again, the Ryzen 5 5500U takes a pretty commanding lead here in terms of providing an overall better and smoother experience. And again, TDP is just one of the biggest indicators of performance in APUs, and I really think a lot more people need to talk about this. As you can see here in Alien Isolation with ultra graphics, the Ryzen 5 5500U again takes a pretty meaningful lead here. TDP is just so important to actually letting you know how much performance you're going to be able to get out of your system that I think it's information that manufacturers really need to disclose, because you could be buying one system that has a specific chip that on paper should be better, but if it's limited to just 15 watts, then a quote-unquote weaker system that is configured for 25 watts or 35 watts or even 45 watts might just actually end up giving you a far better experience. So really, between these two systems, I would recommend just picking up the TRIGKEY over the ACEMAGICIAN, but I'll catch you in the next one.